What we do here is go back. You
are now listening to the Sports-Lit Podcast with Shaheem Sutherland. During an interview with Miami-Dade College's criminal justice professor, Dr. Shawn Schwaner, Schwaner offered advice on how law enforcement could improve their relationship with blacks. In the interview, he was asked about his experience in the field of criminal justice. While providing information on his background in the field, Dr. Schwaner provided information on his upbringing, universities he attended, degrees he obtained, his relationship with athletes that he met while attending and working at universities, and the courses he has taught.
My education, I was born and raised in an African-American family in Toledo. And I was raised in a very poor neighborhood, violent neighborhood, gang-related, drug-related, all that was there. The closest thing that I can recall my neighborhood looked like is like Liberty City is today, if you want to kind of draw a comparison in terms of the structures, the way the houses are built and the way the streets are outlaid and everything like that. But I went to a great private school. Mama Green, who raised me, she wanted my mother to make sure that I had the best education, so I went to a great school, and she socialized me in a lot of her philosophies, having grown up in Arkansas. Then I went to Denison University, just outside of Columbus. And then I went to Ohio State. Well, I was at Ohio State in the sociology department. That's where I started to meet all the athletes. Because one, intramurals, I played on the linebackers intramural basketball team. So I got to know all the players that way. And I had them all in class because there's so many sociology and criminology majors that I was getting the guys going to the NBA and I was getting the guys going to the NFL. So I was very fortunate that I had the opportunity to work behind the scenes with them often. Some of the guys, namely from Cincinnati, big profile names, I can't say his name, but they were street gang members, and they came up to Columbus. They could get out of their gang, but they couldn't go back to Cincinnati unless they were going to rejoin. But they became, All-Americans and things like that. And I started to learn a little bit more about the underground dynamics between some of the drugs, some of the violence, anti-violence, interactions with the police, all that kind of thing. Of course, it's the 80s. It was a different world. So a lot of the things that I learned were really off the field type of thing. My senior thesis at Denison was on the institutionalization of playground basketball and cocaine addiction in the NBA. And in doing that study, I got to speak to sports sociologists all around the nation, like Harry Edwards at Cal Berkeley, and started to learn a little bit more about the discrete signs of who's engaging in what kind of behavior by reading the paper, because they don't tell you what's happening. They give you code words, and he taught me what some of the code words were. So my access to the sports world was very unique. My background from Toledo allowed me access behind the scenes with all the athletes. And I know you can't tell, but back in those days, I could actually shoot. So I'd play horse with them. And the last game of full court basketball I've ever played was with Deion Branch, who ended up being the Super Bowl MVP with the Patriots back in 2003 or 4. So in 2001, that was my last pickup game, was with Deion. And the guy I was telling you about before the interview, Tony Stallings, he was actually it was me and Deion and 3 other guys. And then Tony Stallings was trying to check on Deion, and he couldn't do anything with Deion. Deion just ate him up. But anyhow, so my background between Ohio State, Denison, Toledo, with also the behind-the-scenes ability with the athletes themselves, gave me a unique perspective.
What degrees did you obtain?
Okay. I have a PhD in sociology with emphasis in criminology, bachelor's in sociology, master's in sociology. I have a master's in conflict management, and I have a master's degree in business. So I have several degrees.
And how long have you been teaching the subject of criminology, criminal justice?
I started teaching criminology officially in 1992. No, in 1990 was the first time I taught a criminology class. I was just a recitation leader, but I had 2 classes with 50 each. I had 100 students. That counts for me. So 1990. God, that's a long time. 27 years. Oh, jeez.
What are some of the courses that you teach?
All right. I teach. I teach all the law enforcement classes. Right this semester, I'm teaching crime prevention, human behavior in criminal justice, interpersonal communications in criminal justice. I'm teaching criminal justice, criminology. I typically teach corrections, which I'm teaching now. Criminal justice administration, which is the business management component of it. And then I teach a specialized course, actually. It's called the senior officers class, which is where we actually teach the sergeants, the chiefs, the captains on how to do research to engage better programs in crime control around Miami-Dade, which has been very nice because what we teach is called procedural justice. Procedural justice is essentially this idea that you give people open communication, you give them visibility, you give them transparency, and it's a humane perspective on how to handle any person who the police come in contact with. And by design, it's a de-escalation process so that the use of excessive force is essentially removed from any kind of interaction, even if it's a felony type of situation. So we've been using a lot more training for procedural justice, and then taking a look at spillover deterrence, which is where if we work with chronic offenders, which are high-level offenders within hotspot crime areas, our assumption is that working with them rather than just taking them to jail, if we can work with them and send a different message, they will spread the word to others. And one of the things that we've been working on is finding ex-offenders who have been all the way through the system, including prison, who have been reformed, for lack of a better word. When they come back, we want them to become the leaders of the communities because they can speak the language, they understand the people, they know what's going on underneath. So by giving police the language of procedural justice, they look at people in the communities as people first rather than felons first. And by building the bridge back to the persons who've been through the process, it creates a different kind of dialogue. And we think that over the long term, depending on what happens politically, we think that what will happen over the long term is that Miami will become a model city on how to actually drive down those police shootings. And we're going to do research on that, the police shootings, the excessive force that we're seeing so often in the media. And we've actually started doing the research on that process and its impact. But it's pretty exciting because as far as we know, we're one of the few agencies, definitely one of the few universities that are training that specifically to our police. And given the nature of your first question, it's one of the probably most important type of programs that there is in criminal justice right now, I would think.
What are your thoughts on the social injustices African Americans and people of color face when dealing with law enforcement?
Okay. My answer is a lot more complicated than what you're going to get from most. There's two things that are going on, three things maybe. One, I think that overall rates of violent crime, namely police officer shootings of any citizens, has dropped since the 1990s, a lot. And we overlook the fact that homicide rates, which is all I go by, I don't go by anything else, have decreased by 60-70% since 2000 or since 1990, and it's the same for police shootings on citizens. Police are much more likely to get shot by citizens than the other way around, but the rate is lower. So the frequency, the raw number is higher, but the rate is lower, and that makes it complicated. White Americans are more likely to be shot in terms of frequency, but African Americans are more likely to be shot in terms of the rate per population. So you have a real complicated type of mix on what people know about. All you see on television, however, is African Americans being shot by the police, which makes it look like, in terms of raw number, frequency, and in terms of rate, is vastly much higher than it is. Now, on top of that, however, I think that what I've seen with the rise of some of the right-wing groups, during this political campaign recently, I think that we have seen the resurfacing of a lot of the race relations and the racism, classism that existed in the 1960s. And I don't think it's coming back. I think it was always there. And I think what's happened is that those persons who maintain those beliefs, they are now given an avenue to express those beliefs again. And we're seeing them come up in some terrible, terrible ways. And I'd imagine that over time we can expect to see a rise in hate crime towards African Americans, towards Muslims, towards others. But we have to be real careful on how it's portrayed in the news, because that could be very misleading in terms of what the actual patterns are, in terms of the rates per population. So that's my first thing that I question everything on is, what is the rate? The rates have been going down. People are a lot safer. However, I think that there's been a resurgence of racism, classism in our society, and I think it's been fueled, number three, by social media. And I think social media is playing a huge role in what people are perceiving to be truth and what they're perceiving to be non-truth. And I think that that's a major problem. Since I've lived in Miami, which is 5 years now, I just ride public transportation. And when I first arrived here, I always felt very much at peace, right? In the last 6 months or so, I've seen a lot more disturbance, a lot more stress, people a little bit more edgy than I had seen in my first 3.5 years. And as an outsider, you see things differently anyhow. And that's been a little concern. I think it really started to add up during the presidential campaigns. And I think that that has fueled a lot of this distancing that we're witnessing right now.
What suggestions or what remedies do you think law enforcement can implement to improve their relationship with Black?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I think both sides need to step away from the TV and from social media first and foremost. I think that by design, social media and the news is designed to inflame rather than to reduce the animosity, because it generates more viewership, it generates more revenue through advertising or what have you. I think that's first of all, because it creates for us a common sense on how we assume other people are going to be. And if the only thing we see on TV and social media is that African Americans are perceived to be a quote-unquote threat, then if you're looking through the lens of threat, then it doesn't take much to fulfill the prophecy that that person there is threatening, right? So first of all, walk away from the hype from social media and media. Second of all, I think that moving back towards a community policing model, but not just a community policing. If you can imagine that crime is a stream, right? A river that flows. Right now, the police wait on the banks of the stream. When crime happens, they go in, they pick up the rock that caused the crime, and they make the arrest or what have you. Even in community policing, they step in and then they step out. The way I would do it is I would have police who are in the stream. And I would create the programs where the police are actually walking side by side, not in and out of the community, but in the community, with the community, with those, what do we call them, violence interrupters, former offenders who are now leaders of the community. I'd have them working with them to work with people in the neighborhood. I'd have a division in the police force where they make arrests and all that kind of thing. But I would make sure that community policing is really community policing, and have them actually in the stream. Because right now, nothing's going to happen that's going to be positive. I mean, the system on either side is not set up to be positive. It is set up in an antagonistic way. And I think that the police need to have a fair voice where we get to see that actually most police officers are pretty decent, but they come in contact with criminal offenders. And at the same time, the police need to be in contact with everyday people who are not criminal offenders. At the end of the day, if you start bringing people more and more into contact, you start to change the perception and you start to change the dialogue. The one thing I haven't had any problem with recently is the resurgence of hate, because I felt like it was always underneath the surface. And I feel like by having it bubble up, now we know what the topic is. Now we know where it sits, and now we can start to assemble a way to address it. But I think that on the one hand, yeah, the police need to get in the stream. But on the other hand, I think community members need to also be willing to allow them in the stream, right? So if the idea is that the police are part of this community and not an outsider coming in, and they felt like they were part of the community, it'd be a different kind of dialogue. And I think that, sadly, I think we have years and years to go before we can even start to break the ice. It will require, first of all, it's going to require, on the police part, a proactive approach. And I just saw in Louisville, Kentucky today, where back in the 1990s, what we did is they wanted to reduce gang-related homicide in the city of Louisville. And, they're coming up with all these proposals. I'm new to town. And they kept talking about these gangs. And I just, I asked a couple questions. I said, how many gang members are there in Louisville? And, I got estimates from 500 to 6,000 or something like that. And I said, okay. I said, that's a pretty broad range. I said, how many gangs are there? You guys are the experts. I was with the police. How many gangs? One guy says 3. Another one says there's 2, 3, 400. I said, so either you have 300 gangs with 2 members in it, or you might have 2 gangs with 3,000 members in it. I said, they're vastly different gangs. So how are you going to come up with a solution if you don't know what you're looking at? And we developed a program where the police got in the stream, and we brought in residents from around the community to be a part of the actual solution. They came up with the solution. We had the resources. And then we coordinated with 500 different agencies. So if we came in contact with someone like myself who might be suffering from depression or PTSD, someone with PTSD, we might train the police on what to look for and then channel that person into a program rather than taking them down to jail, right? Well, here's what they did. Back in 98, the number of homicides that year was 68. In 99, it went to 34. So we drove down the rate by 50% in 1 year. And this current year, 2016, Louisville had 117 homicides, which crushes all the records. So what they did was, and I just saw today coming into work, that they have gone after a gang suppression approach. They want to launch a war against street gangs. Well, here's what's going to happen. I promise you what's going to happen. It's going to be the same thing as always. They're coming in with a much more neoconservative perspective. We're going to suppress any kind of voice that's coming out of this community. And if you're a violent offender or you're a threat, we're going to process you differently. And what's going to happen is once you create a war, you create the enemies. I can promise you that there's going to be a lot more hate, a lot more anger. The rates of crime will go up. The reason I bring that up is that if that's the model that's going to be used in Louisville, if that sweeps the country, the idea of having a dialogue is going to take a back seat. And we're going to go back 25, 30 years in terms of those relationships. It requires, and it will require, at the level of police chief and probably mayor, that they want to do something in terms of being proactive and create a communication system where both groups have the ability to communicate across these boundaries and create a clearinghouse, which is an information center, so that when I come across, Curry, as a young person, I can say, okay, he's doing this, this, and this. Why don't we put him over here in this program, which is what Jack does, Juvenile Assessment Center. They have a thing called civil citation. So if you get caught for a low-level offense, they're going to process you through informal means so that it doesn't go formally on your record, because it becomes an escalation process. So take Curry, say, okay, here's what he needs. Let the Jack take care of him, and let's then follow him and process him. And when he's going off track, let's get him back in the program. It's right here in Miami, and it's one of the nation's premier diversionary programs at a Juvenile Assessment Center. The programs that they're running are fantastic, and they keep databases. They keep contact with the people that come in, and they make sure that they try to keep them from becoming felonious offenders. It's great, because if we go the other way, homicide rates have stayed low, at the historical lows since the 1950s, sitting around 4 per 100,000, which is what it was in 50. The peak was around 10.2 per 100,000 back in 1992, 1981, 1982. We can keep it low at 4. The issue is that if we start to dislodge those organizational pieces that give people avenues, and all we do is create a war, that rate will go back up. Since 2008, the economy did like this, right? So if it did like this, if it went down, you would expect for there to be an increase in violent crime, but there wasn't. So the quota stayed flat, except for African American men ages 18 to like 24. That's the only group, which means there's an employment situation, education situation. Ironically, suicide stayed flat in that same period of time. But in 2008, the rate of suicide went up for white males 45 to 54, at a higher rate than homicide went up for black males. So if we look at suicide as violent as compared to homicide as violent, why then aren't we focusing more attention on white males who are becoming more self-directed violent than the one group of African American males who are becoming, not becoming, just gradually, but it's the only category that saw an increase? Why the focus? Why not take a look at what the nature of the underlying forces are, which are economic? It's almost always economic. It is education, and it is access to labor. You can't even put jobs in Liberty City because it's not zoned and the infrastructure isn't built for it. So how do you fix it? You get lucky and Teddy Bridgewater ends up getting, number 3 or 4 coming out of, because he came out of there, right? Getting number 3 or 4 in Heisman. He gets an avenue out. That's not good enough. Saving one kid isn't enough when you have the resources. How are we going to build all these buildings downtown, right? They can't put enough people in all those new $1 million apartments. But we can build that, but we can't fix Liberty City and Opelika. And, Overtown will get fixed by virtue of being, because they're building that great big center right there by the Metro Rail. So that'll be gentrified soon, just like Coconut Grove is going to be gentrified.
But they're moving them down south.
They're moving down to Homestead. And Homestead has a unique situation because you have the people who already live there. And this is what happened in Louisville. Then you move people from outside, and if there is gang activity, I don't know, it's a different type of vibe here in Miami. But if you move persons from Coconut Grove that have this cultural history here into Homestead, then you take Overtown with their different cultural history, you're creating a scenario where you're going to have an outburst. And if it's not managed from the top down, and you don't have the jobs and all those things in place, you're looking at major problems down there if they don't fix it before all the gentrification happens up here in Miami.
Last question.
Yes.
Can you go over any advice you give your students when dealing with law enforcement?
Be quiet. You have to be quiet. And I know there's stuff on social media. Well, they were quiet. They weren't doing anything. They still get no. The Polybian and Breyer, 1967. They will show that the odds of arrest go up based upon demeanor and demeanor only, not the nature of the crime. So if all things are equal, a person who is diplomatic in the response to the police versus someone who stands up to the police for the same crime, the one who stands up is going to get arrested. They're much more likely to get arrested. So the first thing is diplomacy, respect, because you have to respect that. There is authority behind that badge. Respect that authority. And my advisor used to be a defense attorney, and he said, don't talk. Get your attorney and get your rights ironed out. And I know that's hard in, real life situations, but essentially it is, be respectful and contact an attorney and let the attorney represent you. Even if it's a court mandated attorney, right? You're still better off. Because the one thing that you don't want to do is undermine the authority of someone in authority. And that's regardless of race, right? But that's in the situation of police contact, right? Outside of that, having an open dialogue, I think communities need to foster that dialogue, whether it's through town halls, whether the police do it or whomever, whether MDC does it. I think they have to have the dialogue, but there's so much work to do on both ends in terms of both groups learning how to communicate across those lines. Right? Did that answer your question?
It did.
Right, be quiet. Right, just be respectful and diplomatic. And both groups, when there's a police contact, especially over a crime, if you think about it just in terms of human position, the police, their adrenaline is up. And that person who's come in contact with the adrenaline, or with the police, their adrenaline is up. Two men with high adrenaline, that's not necessarily a great situation. So the schools need to teach conflict management. In other words, how to find alternative communication devices during interpersonal forms of conflict. The schools don't teach that at all. Not at all.